From the arid Libyan deserts emerged an unusual and extravagant leader who ruled with political cunning and with the peace of the iron fist, a millennial nation loaded with tribal tensions. A savvy and ambitious leader who sought to establish himself as the continental leader of Africans and Arabs, relying on large reserves of gold and oil with which he proposed to create a new single currency for the African region. African, then fallen from grace due to the rejection of many Libyans who condemned his excesses and who saw in foreign powers the perfect alliance to get rid of a regime that was over 40 years old. A bold and eccentric leader who threw parties in desert tents with artists like Beyoncé and Enrique Iglesias, while rubbing elbows with presidents like Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Sarkozy, while financing international terrorist cells. For some a megalomaniac maniac, for others a benefactor developer of the people, for some the one who brought social peace, and for others the one who brought the material and cultural destruction of the country. Today we are going to delve into the life of Muammar Gaddafi. This is Rinaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to support us by liking this video, leaving your comment, sharing it with your acquaintances, activating the bell so you get notifications, and above all that you collaborate on our Patreon, which you can find below this material. Muammar Gaddafi was born in Sirte and grew up in a Libya occupied by Italy. Most don't know about his childhood. The son of a Sunni Muslim herdsman, as a child he was put to study the Quran and did not have a formal education until he was 10 years old. From a young age, he lived with the stories of the Libyan fighters who stood up to foreign invasions at the beginning of the 20th century. A resentment for foreigners was formed in him, as the Italians killed his grandfather and tortured his father fighting against Italian colonization. What is known today as Libya is an extensive territory 5 times larger than Italy. Since before Christ, it was home to Phoenician, Greek, and later part of the Roman Empire. In the 7th century after Christ, it was conquered by Muslim Arabs and Islamized, the territory. In 1551, it came under the control of the Ottoman Empire. In 1910, the territory was colonized by Italy after a harsh 10-year war, until Italy was defeated in the Second World War. And handed over the territory to France and England, the Allies decided to form what we know today as the Libyan state, founded in 1951 as a kingdom of Libya when Gaddafi was 9 years old, this being the first African colony to legally achieve the status of an independent country. However, it was a precarious country with little capacity to govern itself, and in the monarchy there continued to be a high level of Anglo-Saxon and Saudi Arabian influence. When Gaddafi entered school, his classmates mocked him for his Bedouin origin, which is a particular Arab subgroup of desert nomads, and for a long time he avoided being at home and slept in the mosque. At some point in the 1950s, his family moved from Sirte to an arid and desert area of Libya, and it was then that Gaddafi became interested in politics, began to engage in political activism, and for the next 10 years began to plan the overthrow of the government of King Idris of Libya. By the early 1950s, the figure of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt made an imprint on him, and he decided to emulate his trajectory in pan-Arabist, anti-Zionist, and anti-colonial thinking. Nasser was one of the main exponents of so-called Arab socialism, a current that led anti-colonial governments in countries such as Iraq, Syria, Algeria, and South Yemen. A diverse movement of more or less secular and socialist nature that sought the unification of the Arab world. By the time oil exploitation begins in Libya, British and American companies take over the extraction activity and an economic boom begins in the country, but it did not translate into an improvement in the living conditions of the Libyans. Charismatic and inspiring, as well as cunning, Gaddafi accumulates many followers in his political activism. And between the 60s and 70s, he organizes many protests. By 1963, at the age of 21, he enrolls in the military academy and urges his followers to do the same so that they can later take power with weapons. At the Benghazi Military Academy, he comes across many officers who drank, gambled, and did not lead a peaceful life, according to the Muslim creed, which deeply bothers him. With his followers, he founds a clandestine resistance movement that is gaining great support. In his military training, he begins to kill his rivals, torture his opponents, and accumulate influences. And as Nasserist pan-Arabism gains strength in the region, so does the clandestine support for Gaddafi. In the summer of 1967, Israel attacks Egypt, and Jordan and Syria attack Israel in the Six-Day War, resulting in a humiliating defeat for the Arab countries, sparking great outrage in the Arab world. The military in Libya expected some kind of response from the monarchy, but that did not happen, so anti-American protests emerged, an oil strike, and a great popular discontent that marked the end of King Idris's monarchy in Libya. In 1969, Gaddafi had about 7,000 men in his ranks and planned for a coup on March 12th of that year that aborts at the last minute due to a denunciation that takes him to jail, where they interrogate him but fail to get any confession out of him. On September 1st of 1969, the opportunity presents itself again, and a revolution led by Gaddafi begins, who takes advantage of the fact that King Idris had traveled to Turkey. He takes power in Benghazi and Tripoli, and in a matter of hours takes control of the entire country. The royalist forces surrendered, and Muammar Gaddafi proclaims on the radio the end of the monarchy and the establishment of the new Arab Republic of Libya, with the motto freedom, socialism, and unity inspired, or perhaps too much in Gamal Abdel Nasser begins to improvise to integrate Libya into the pan-Arab movement. After taking power, he promotes himself to the rank of colonel, and the governments of the United States and Great Britain do not oppose the uprising because Gaddafi did not get involved in the issue of the interests of oil corporations. Although Gaddafi made several arms purchases from the Soviet Union, his Muslim creed, like the Arab socialism movement, despised communism. Gaddafi's revolution replaces the monarchy with a council of revolutionary commanders made up of a dozen of Gaddafi's closest collaborators. But neither Gaddafi nor his 12 friends knew how to run a country, so they asked Gamal Abdel Nasser to assist them. Nasser, who sends the young colonel of just 27 years old as a naive and uprising revista, charges him for the advice, while in his inner circle he expressed this consumption of disdain and mockery. The revolution imprisons and persecutes the monarchists, expropriates their properties, kidnaps some of their women and children, and progressively eliminates the tribal government system in remote regions. Inspired by nationalism, he expels every American, British, and Italian who had nothing to do with the oil activity and refrains for the moment from meddling with that oil sector because he knew that among the Libyans there were no professionals capable of taking control of an industry like that, which brought in the majority of the country's income. In September of 1970, Gamal Abdel Nasser dies of a heart attack and the young Colonel Gadafi is left without a mentor. But far from being depressed, he takes his opportunity to now want to prove himself on the international stage as the new leader of pan-Arabism. For 1971, he organizes 2 failed attempts at popular voting, in which abstention wins because the Libyans neither understood nor wanted to know about elections, as they preferred the tribal government system to which they had been accustomed for centuries over a socialist electoral democracy. On April 16, 1973, Gaddafi announces a popular revolution with 5 key points. Gaddafi would be the sole author of the laws that would govern Libya. He would remove the bourgeoisie from power, create a huge revolutionary militia that he arms as a paramilitary arm, and begins, inspired by Mao Zedong, an Islamic cultural revolution aimed at erasing from history the traces of foreign colonization. This popular revolution organized civil committees that purged the governmental apparatus based on Islamic Sharia law, and also proposes the creation of the Third International Way, a sort of very own Libyan fusion between Islam and socialism that was cemented in the iron control of the state through the Quran, and a state capitalism that Colonel Gaddafi would personally lead. Through a hard hand against opponents, political and social peace is achieved. Over the following years, the government partially nationalizes the oil industry, gaining 60% control of it, promotes agrarian reform, develops an extensive social security network with public medical services and subsidized electricity distribution, as well as subsidizing gasoline, bank loans, the purchase of vehicles, as well as secondary and university studies. All this in the natural precariousness of a people who did not build this system on their own. The global oil price boom allows these high levels of public investment without having to resort to lavish loans from abroad. In this way, the living conditions of the Libyans change, the economy is energized, and the per capita income increases. In 1979, he publishes the famous Green Book, a roadmap for the international revolution where he exposes his solutions for the issue of democracy, economy, and social organization. Many in the Arab world view this with disdain. There he proposed a stateless society led by him, but that would be governed by a sort of variation of the tribal system by which the Libyan tribes had lived for thousands of years. Accused of paving the way to tyranny by sectors that opposed him, Libyan intellectual students protest and are harshly repressed by his paramilitary groups. This strict surveillance and punishment against dissent remained the norm, which was already characteristic of almost any government in the region. By March of 1979, Gaddafi self-imposes the grandiose title of the Leader Brother and dissolves the Council of Buddies that accompanied him in the coup against King Idris. He shuts down media, takes over the judiciary, and places judges aligned with him. By the 1980s, almost all of the income of the Libyan state treasury came from the extraction and sale of hydrocarbons. With that money, he builds hospitals, schools, universities, and a housing program for the people. Throughout the 1980s, they maintain hostile policies against small traders, veto private trade in 1984, and make all food distribution fall into the hands of a state network of food markets that make access to food difficult and cause black markets to appear that the authorities pursued. It was common to see people arrested and photographed with packages of flour and loaves of bread, accused of being smugglers. Also during this time, one of the world's largest irrigation projects, the great artificial river that provides water to desert areas of Libya, begins to be built. With abundant oil revenues, Libya manages to accumulate large gold reserves and becomes one of the most influential countries in Africa. With these gold and silver reserves, after the year 2000, Gaddafi leads one of the most significant proposals that, according to some analysts, was one of the main factors for foreign forces to support the rebels in his overthrow. The proposal was the creation of a new African currency to replace the American dollar and the French franc for commercial and oil transactions in Africa. This new currency, the gold dinar, would be based on the gold standard and not on the fiat money standard of the dollar. Nicolas Sarkozy, president of France, a country with a strong presence in Africa, even referred to the Libyan government as a threat to the world's financial security. Leaked emails from Hillary Clinton showed that for the U.S. and French governments, these abundant gold reserves were a cause for concern, along with the management of Libyan oil reserves. But we will come back to this later. Going back to the 70s and 80s, in his pan-Arabist, pan-Africanist, and anti-Western zeal, Gaddafi supports other African leaders such as John Badal Bokassa in the Central African Republic and Idi Amin in Uganda. But it didn't stop there, because he also decided to get involved in the Arab-Palestinian conflict, giving money, weapons, asylum, and other logistical support to George Habash's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and his envoy Carlos the Jackal. He also rubbed shoulders with Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization and finances Islamist and anti-Western movements such as the Irish Republican Army, the Italian Red Brigades, and the Baader Meinhof gang from East Germany. On the other hand, the former monarchy of Iraq was an Islamist monarchy where women adhered to a more traditional role typical of the Quran. While Gaddafi's government, although also based on Islam, seeks to make some changes to this. Equality of men and women under the law in certain aspects is approved, as well as wage parity. In 1972, the marriage of women under 16 years of age is also penalized, and it is legally required that the marriage has the woman's consent. For years, he maintained a squad of female bodyguards called the Revolutionary Nuns. Gaddafi claimed that the use of female guards demonstrated his devotion to feminism. Others rather said that he believed that Arab men would not shoot these women who took care of him. For 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States meant a change in that country's foreign policy towards many countries, and Libya was no exception. The hostility between Washington and Tripoli was evident. Reagan called Gaddafi a mad dog of the Middle East, and Gaddafi mocked Reagan's Hollywood past. Due to Libya's antagonistic policy against Israel and Libya's strategic value in Africa and the Middle East for the interests of Israel and the United States, Washington imposes embargoes and sanctions on the Libyan regime, limits the movements of Gaddafi's diplomats in New York, and closes the American embassy in Tripoli. Gaddafi evades the sanctions by selling oil to Europe and fills the pockets and campaigns of French and Italian leaders, something he did well into the 2000 decade. On April 5th of 1986, a bomb explodes in a West Berlin nightclub frequented by American military personnel in an investigation of indications that the Gaddafi government had allegedly been behind it. With this argument, on April 15th of 1986, Ronald Reagan orders the bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi, destroying palaces, military complexes, and defenses of a colonel who barely survives the attack. Gaddafi believed that the bombing of his country would awaken solidarities for him in the Arab world, but the Arab world stood by with crossed arms. On the other hand, on December 21st of 88, a Pan Am plane that took off from London exploded 45 minutes after starting the flight, causing hundreds of fatal victims. By November of 91, 2 Libyan terrorists were accused of being the alleged perpetrators, responsible for planting the bomb on this plane, and the United States and the United Kingdom demand Gaddafi to hand over the accused, but he refuses, and in 1992 the UN Security Council applies new harsh sanctions to Libya, although it does not prohibit its oil sales. So with few goods and services entering the country, a tremendous inflation is unleashed. And Gaddafi cuts the salaries of all public employees except his own and his family's. The 90s were terrible for Libya, and discontent against Gaddafi was accumulating, but it would take at least 10 more years for it to become a threat to the government. Military purges were constant, and Islamist groups were organizing in the country and abroad to conspire against the colonel who exhibited extravagant behaviors. By the end of the 90s, Gaddafi had eliminated most of his opposition. He had also eliminated the Islamist jihadists in his region, so he decides to hand over the terrorists responsible for the plane bombing to be tried in The Hague in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. A small economic boom enters the country, foreign investment returns, and in 2003 he accepts state responsibility for the attack, deciding to pay millions of dollars to the families of the victims. At the beginning of the 2000 decade, George W. arrives. Bush to the White House, and the United States war policy in the Middle East intensifies. Bush seeks to dismantle Gaddafi's arms race, and in exchange for foreign investment, he allows his air defenses to be eliminated. Around the same time, Gaddafi's son, Saeed al-Islam Gaddafi, carries out a series of reforms to improve the regime's image to the world, all while his family and the ruling elites led ostentatious lifestyles, had villas and beach houses, drove luxury vehicles, threw parties in desert tents with artists like Mariah Carey, Nelly Furtado, Usher, Enrique Iglesias, and Beyoncé. In a land of family clans, Gaddafi relied on his sons and relatives, placing them in key positions in industry and government. But the revolution against Gaddafi did not start in Libya, but in Tunisia in 2010 when protests organized through social media overthrew the Tunisian government. Then the Discontent sequel to Egypt, ending the regime of Hosni Mubarak. And then Gaddafi feels threatened by what was known as the Arab Spring, which was born from the discontent of many inhabitants against their governments, while receiving significant support from internal groups trained and financed by Western powers. Gaddafi appeases his opponents, offers reforms, releases political prisoners, but those measures came too late. On February 15, 2011, a series of arrests against Libyan opponents triggers popular unrest. Benghazi, Tripoli, and the rest of Libya rise up against the government. So many years in the regime earned him many opposing groups that were about to explode. By the end of February 2011, Libya was in civil war. The rebels formed a revolutionary council in Benghazi and received support from the United States and NATO, which imposed a no-fly zone over Libyan territory, thus minimizing the colonel's repressive power. With the approval of the UN, NATO enters Libyan territory, trains and assists the Libyan rebels, and conducts joint offensives against Gaddafi's government. This multinational military operation is approved under the pretext of protecting Libyan civilians, although leaked documents and analysts of the time suggest that it was more about safeguarding geo-economic interests around the hegemony of the petrodollar and the administration of Libyan oil. On August 20, 2011, the rebels take Tripoli and Gaddafi flees with a convoy to Sirte, his hometown. Gaddafi's end came in several stages. On one hand, the uprisings in the east of his country, the fights for communication routes on the coast, also the bombings of Lotan, the sieges of Misrata and Sabila, the fall of Tripoli, and finally the bloody battle in the city of Sirte, his hometown. In the days after the rebels took Tripoli, the rebels dramatized their triumph in front of the visible symbols of Gaddafi's power that they iconoclastically detonated and celebrated in front of their flames. They replaced the green flag with the tricolor of King Idris. Thus, in autumn, on October 20th of 2011, Gaddafi's nomadic convoy that was going from one place to another seeking shelter is detected by a NATO drone and is bombed, leaving the convoy useless, so Gaddafi and his allies flee on foot to take refuge in a nearby sewer drain. The rebels attack what remains of the convoy and find Muammar Gaddafi hidden in a pipe. They drag him, beat him, and display him to those present while he pleads for his life. The onlookers use their social media accounts to broadcast his last moments before dying from a gunshot to the temple by the same rebels, ending 4 decades of his rule. His body was then displayed to the public for 2 days. Gaddafi had warned that his death would bring back jihadists as well as internal civil wars in Libya, and indeed it did. Gaddafi's death did not mark a change in Libya. As before in the history of that country, its fate has been dictated by foreign powers since ancient times, what the Romans, Ottomans, Italians, British, and then NATO have decided. With the physical disappearance of Gaddafi would come another crisis marked by the conflict between the rebels and Islamist factions, then the threat of the Islamic State and the lack of governance of a region full of tribal conflicts. Today, Libya remains a failed state without signs of stability, while the memory of Gaddafi in that region is becoming increasingly blurred. Reynaldo Carrillo spoke to you. This is the New Encyclopedia. I hope you like this video. Share it with your acquaintances, hit the bell so you get the notifications, and don't forget to support us on our Patreon so we can continue bringing you quality videos. Until next time, and may God bless you.